The paper shook in Augusta Wainwright's hands, not because the wind had picked up through the cracked window of Seth Barker's ranch house, not because the morning was cold. The paper shook because Seth had just read her proposal, set it face down on the table between them, and looked at her with eyes that held something she had not expected to find in this place, in this man, in this moment of pure business negotiation. He looked at her like she had wounded him. "You want me to sell you half of Barker's Ridge," he said. The words came out slow and deliberate, the way a man speaks when he is working very hard to keep something controlled inside his chest. "For the purpose of establishing a cattle operation under your late husband's name." "Under my name," Augusta corrected. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced that. For 3 weeks on the train from St. Louis and for 2 days in the boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas, she had rehearsed every possible version of this conversation. She had anticipated resistance. She had anticipated greed. She had anticipated the particular brand of contempt that men in 1883 reserved for women who arrived alone with money and ambition. The Wainwright Cattle Company, my name, my investment, my operation. Seth stood from the table. He was taller than she had imagined from the letters they had exchanged through the land office, broader across the shoulders. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and there was a scar that ran along his jaw that she had not been informed of. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, and the silence stretched between them like barbed wire. "Your husband has been dead 11 months, he said. "Yes. And you rode 2 days on horseback from Caldwell with a land proposal and a bank draft." "I did." He turned. The morning light caught him in a way that was entirely inconvenient for Augusta's carefully maintained composure. There was something raw in his expression, something that had no business being there in a transaction between strangers. "What are you really after, Mrs. Wainwright?" She had not anticipated that question, not that exact phrasing, not that exact tone, not the way his dark eyes seemed to cut straight through her rehearsed presentation and arrive at something she had not yet admitted to herself. "I told you what I am after," she said. "You told me what you want to buy," Seth said. "That is not the same thing." Augusta Wainwright had arrived at Barker's Ridge with a proposal. She would leave with something she had not thought to propose, but neither of them knew that yet. And the knowing of it would cost them both more than any amount printed on a bank draft. It had begun, as most catastrophic and magnificent things begin, with a letter. 3 months before that morning, Augusta sat in the parlor of the home she had shared with her husband, Congressman Theodore Wainwright, and sorted through the legal correspondence that had arrived following his death. Theodore had been 22 years her senior, a man of enormous political ambition and considerable private failings, and when he died of a heart seizure in November of 1882, he left Augusta with a respectably managed grief, a substantial inheritance, and a letter she found hidden in his desk that changed everything. The letter was from a man named Gerald Voss, a land speculator operating out of Wichita, and it outlined in excruciating detail Theodore's silent partnership in a scheme to defraud homesteaders across southern Kansas by falsifying water rights records. The scheme had been ongoing for 7 years. It had destroyed perhaps 40 families. And Theodore Wainwright, decorated congressman and beloved public servant, had received a portion of the profits every quarter. Augusta burned the letter. She sat with the ashes for a long time. Then she went to her writing desk and began to plan. She would not expose Theodore. She understood, with a cold and precise clarity, that exposing Theodore would expose the families he had worked with, the political machinery that had protected the scheme, and the dozen other men whose names she suspected but could not prove. The scandal would be enormous, it would be ugly, and it would accomplish nothing for the people who had actually suffered. Courts in Kansas in 1882 were not interested in delivering justice to homesteaders who had been cheated by powerful men, but she could do something with the money. Theodore's estate was worth approximately $40,000. Augusta had independent access to 12,000 of that through her own family's trust, which Theodore had never quite managed to appropriate despite several creative attempts during their 8 years of marriage. She would use Theodore's money to pay debts she could quietly trace back to the fraud. She would use her own money to build something legitimate, something that employed people and contributed to the land rather than stealing from it. Something that required a partner who knew the territory and could be trusted. That requirement had narrowed the field considerably. She had written to 3 land offices in southern Kansas, requesting information about ranchers with good reputations and an interest in expansion. 2 of them never responded. The third forwarded her inquiry to a man named Seth Barker, who operated a cattle ranch of approximately 1,200 acres in the Flint Hills, who was known by the land office clerk as a man of reliable character and no particular patience for dishonesty. Seth had written back. His letter was brief and grammatically unconventional and entirely direct. He said he was not interested in selling any portion of Barker's Ridge, but he was willing to hear an explanation of the proposal in person if she was serious about it. He said if she was not serious about it, she should not waste either of their time making the trip. Augusta had found the letter unexpectedly refreshing. She had written back to confirm that she was entirely serious and had begun making arrangements immediately. What she had not arranged for was the man himself. Barker's Ridge in the spring of 1883 was extraordinary country. The Flint Hills rolled and folded under a sky so large and uninterrupted that Augusta, who had spent the majority of her adult life in St. Louis, felt the particular disorientation of a person who has been living inside rooms for too long and suddenly finds herself beneath something infinite. The grass was coming up green, and the limestone outcroppings caught the light and turned it golden in the early morning, and there were meadowlarks calling from fence posts, and the air smelled of earth and green things and cattle and the particular clean sharpness of a Kansas spring that had nothing whatsoever in common with anything Augusta had ever encountered in Missouri. She had ridden out from Caldwell with a local guide, a taciturn man named Pete who communicated primarily through shoulder movements, and was clearly somewhat alarmed by a woman who rode as confidently as Augusta did, and asked almost no questions about the terrain. Augusta had grown up on her father's horse farm in Virginia before her family's fortunes declined, and she moved to St. Louis to marry Theodore, and she had never forgotten how to ride. She had also never forgotten that the most important thing about arriving somewhere to negotiate is to arrive looking like a person who cannot be managed. She arrived at Barker's Ridge at 7:30 in the morning, and Seth Barker was already in the yard. She had been watching him for about 90 seconds before he heard the horses and turned, and in those 90 seconds she cataloged several things that the land office clerk had not mentioned in his written description. He was perhaps 33 or 34 years old. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who does physical labor as a matter of daily reality rather than exercise. There was a quality of stillness in him that reminded Augusta of the limestone outcroppings she had ridden past, something old and weathered, and not easily moved. He was looking at her now with an expression she could not immediately categorize, and that alone was interesting because Augusta was very good at reading expressions. "Mrs. Wainwright," he said. "Mr. Barker." She dismounted without waiting for assistance and handed her reins to Pete with a nod of dismissal. "I appreciate you agreeing to this meeting." "I haven't agreed to anything yet," Seth said, but he held the door to the ranch house open for her, and Augusta walked inside. The interior of the house surprised her. She had expected the rough and purely functional interior of a working bachelor's ranch, and there were elements of that, certainly. The furniture was plain and heavy and built to last rather than to impress. The floor was clean packed dirt with a few braided rugs. There was a cast iron stove of reasonable quality and a scarred wooden table that had clearly served as dining table, work surface, and conference table for years. But there were also books, a considerable number of them, arranged on shelves built directly into the log walls. And there was a framed drawing above the fireplace of a woman with her back to the viewer, looking out over what was clearly the Flint Hills, done in charcoal with unusual skill. And there were flowers in a tin can on the windowsill. Augusta sat down at the table and opened her document case. Seth made coffee without asking if she wanted any, which she appreciated, and set a cup in front of her and one at his own place and sat down and looked at her. She laid out the proposal. She explained the investment, the operational structure, the profit-sharing arrangement, the timeline for building a breeding herd. She explained that she had relevant experience through her father's horse operation in Virginia, and that she had been educating herself on cattle specifically for the past 3 months. She explained that she had the capital and that she wanted a partner who had the land and the knowledge and the established relationships with buyers and suppliers in the region. She slid the bank draft across the table as the closing argument. Seth read the entire document carefully. She gave him credit for that. He did not skim it. He did not dismiss it. He read every word and then he turned it face down and looked at her with those dark eyes that held something she could not name. "What are you really after, Mrs. Wainwright?" She told him what she was after: the business, the operation, the chance to build something that had her name on it and was genuinely hers. He did not call her a liar exactly. He just looked at her like he could see that there was more to the story and was patient enough to wait for the rest of it. "I want to know why a widow from St. Louis with $12,000 rides 2 days on horseback to a ranch in the Flint Hills instead of buying her own land," he said. $12,000 would buy land. Not as much as I have, but enough to start something. $12,000 would buy land, Augusta agreed. It would not buy a decade of established relationships with the cattle buyers in Wichita and Abilene. It would not buy 10 years of knowledge about which sections of the Flint Hills hold water through a dry summer and which ones don't. It would not buy the reputation that makes other ranchers willing to cooperative drive their cattle with yours to the railhead. She paused. "I'm not naive, Mr. Barker. I know what I have and I know what I am missing. I came here because you have what I am missing." Something shifted in his expression. "That is the most honest thing you've said since you walked in," he said. "I have been honest about everything." "You have been accurate," he said. "That is not the same thing." Augusta looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was strengthening through the window and the coffee was good, stronger than she was accustomed to and better for it. She could hear cattle somewhere outside and the distant sound of a man calling to someone, probably one of the ranch hands. "What would it take," she said carefully, "for you to say yes to this proposal?" Seth leaned back in his chair. "I have to think about whether I want a partner at all," he said. "I built this ranch alone. I run it alone. I make decisions alone. That has suited me." "It has also limited your potential expansion," Augusta said. "Your acreage is not growing. Your herd size has been stable for 3 years. I read everything the land office had on Barker's Ridge before I made this trip. You are a good rancher, but you are at the limit of what one man can manage and finance alone." She watched something move across his face. Not offense, closer to recognition. The expression of a man who has been quietly aware of a truth and is slightly startled to hear it said aloud. "You did your research," he said. "I always do my research." He stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the land, and Augusta watched his back and the way the light played along the lines of tension in his shoulders and thought, not for the first time, that this was a man carrying something heavy that had nothing to do with cattle. "I will give you an answer by tomorrow morning," he said finally. "I need to think. You are welcome to stay here tonight. There is a room. It was my sister's before she married and went to Colorado." He turned and looked at her directly. "This is not an unusual arrangement in this country. The closest boarding house is in Caldwell, which is where you came from." "I am aware," Augusta said. "I accept." She should have expected that staying the night would change things. She understood abstractly that proximity to a person was a different quantity than correspondence with that person. But she had been so focused on the proposal, on the business, on the practical architecture of the arrangement she wanted to build, that she had not properly accounted for the reality of Seth Barker as a three-dimensional human being occupying shared space. He cooked supper himself, which surprised her. The two ranch hands, a young man named Caleb and a quieter older man named Domingo, ate at the bunkhouse separately. Seth made a venison stew that was considerably better than anything Augusta could have produced herself, a fact she acknowledged freely, and which seemed to please him in a way he tried not to show. They ate at the scarred table and talked, not about the proposal, about other things. He asked her about Virginia, and she told him about her father's horses, and the way the Blue Ridge looked in October, and how the farm had felt after her father died and the bank took most of it. He listened without interruption, which was not something she had experienced often in her years of marriage to Theodore. She asked him about the drawing above the fireplace. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother," he said. "She liked to stand out there on the East Ridge and look down at the valley in the evenings. My father drew it. He was a better artist than he was a rancher." He paused. "They both died in the winter of 1873, a fever that came through this part of the territory. I was 23. I had been working the ranch with my father for 5 years. After they were gone, I just kept working it." Augusta set down her fork. There was something in the simple plainness of that recounting that struck her more than she was comfortable with. He had been 23 and alone, and he had just kept working. She understood something about that. The particular discipline of grief that presents as productivity. The way you build things when what you actually want is to stop and fall apart, but you cannot allow yourself that luxury because there is no one else to do what needs doing. "You have been alone here for 10 years, she said. "I have had ranch hands," he said. "That is not what I meant." He looked at her across the table. "No," he said. "I know what you meant." The evening cooled and they moved to sit near the stove, and Seth produced a bottle of good Kentucky bourbon that he said a cattle buyer from Wichita had left as a gift. And Augusta accepted a glass, because she was not a woman who refused bourbon on principle. And the conversation moved in directions that had nothing to do with land proposals or business arrangements. He told her about the hidden springs on the eastern section of the property, the ones that did not appear on any survey map, because he had found them himself, and had never reported them to the land office, because he did not trust the land office to keep that information properly private. He told her about the winter 3 years ago when a blizzard had come in fast, and he had been out on the North Ridge with 30 head of cattle, and had to make decisions very quickly about what could be saved and what could not, and how he had not lost a single animal, but had come home with frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand that still ached in cold weather. He showed her the fingers. She looked at them without speaking and did not touch them, though she had an impulse to that she did not examine too closely. She told him about Theodore, not about the letter she had found, not about the fraud, but about the marriage itself, the 8 years of it, the way she had entered it with genuine hopes and discovered over time that she was largely decorative in Theodore's life, a presentable and well-spoken wife who could host dinners and navigate political society, and be relied upon to say nothing interesting or inconvenient. She had not been unhappy exactly. She had been understimulated and slowly, quietly furious in a way she had not fully recognized as fury until Theodore died, and she sat in the parlor with his correspondence, and understood for the first time in years that she was completely free to be something entirely different from what she had been. Seth listened to all of this without offering commentary or reassurance, which was the correct response, and the one she had needed without knowing she needed it. When she went to bed in the small room that had been his sister's, she lay in the dark and listened to the enormous Flint Hills silence and thought about what she was doing. She was here for a business proposal. She was here to build something honest with Theodore's dishonest money and her own honest money, to make something productive from the wreckage of her previous life. She was not here to find anything personal. She was not in the market for any kind of personal arrangement. She had just exited one, and she had not yet finished processing the liberation of it, and she absolutely was not going to complicate a clean business negotiation with anything emotional. She was fairly certain she was already in trouble. Seth Barker lay in his own room on the other side of the thin log wall and stared at the ceiling, and had what he would have described, if pressed, as a deeply inconvenient internal experience. He had agreed to hear the proposal because the land office clerk, a man named Harrison who had known Seth for years, had told him that the woman inquiring was serious and had money, and that it might be worth his time. Seth had not expected to find the inquiry interesting. He had fully expected to spend one polite morning explaining that Barker's Ridge was not a business partnership and sending the widow back to St. Louis. He had not expected Augusta Wainwright. He lay in the dark and cataloged what he knew about her so far, which was the habit of a man who had learned that the gap between what he knew and what he assumed was where most of his mistakes lived. She was direct to the point of being jarring. She was educated in a way that had weight to it rather than decoration. She rode well. She asked precise questions. She had laughed exactly once during supper, when he had told her about the time a particularly stubborn bull had cornered him against the fence for 40 minutes while Caleb watched from a safe distance and offered no assistance whatsoever, and the laugh had been genuine and unguarded and had changed her face entirely. She was also carrying something. He could see it. It was not the ordinary grief of a widow because there was no particular sadness in how she spoke of Theodore Wainwright. It was something older and more specific than grief, something that looked more like the quiet, determined expression of a person who has decided to correct something that was wrong. He did not know what it was. He found that he wanted to know. That wanting was itself the problem. Seth had been careful, in the 10 years since his parents died and left him alone on this land, not to want things that were not practical. He wanted good weather and healthy cattle and fair prices at the Wichita market and reliable ranch hands and enough water through the dry season. He did not allow himself to want things in the personal category, because the personal category was where you became vulnerable to losses you could not afford, and he had already absorbed as much of that kind of loss as he felt equipped to handle. Augusta Wainwright was not a practical want. She was a complication. She was a woman who had ridden 2 days on horseback with a business proposal, and a dark past she was not fully disclosing, and she was going to leave tomorrow morning either with his agreement or without it, and he was not sure which outcome was safer. He got up before dawn and made coffee and stood on the porch and watched the sky go from black to indigo to the particular shade of deep blue that preceded sunrise in the Flint Hills, and he thought about what his father would have said. His father would have said that the land always needed more than one person's attention. His father would have said that a person who does their research and rides 2 days on horseback for a business meeting is a person worth taking seriously. His father also would have said, with the particular sideways humor that had been his mode of communication, that a woman who makes a man think this hard before sunrise is probably not someone you should send away. Seth had his answer when Augusta came out onto the porch at sunrise with her own coffee, her dark hair pinned back but not as neatly as it had been the previous morning, and she stood next to him and looked out at the eastern ridge where the sun was beginning to paint everything gold and said nothing. They stood in that silence for a full 5 minutes. "Yes," Seth said. She turned and looked at him. "To the proposal," he said, "with modifications." Augusta set her coffee cup down on the porch railing carefully. "What modifications?" "The profit split is 60-40 in my favor for the first 3 years," he said. "After 3 years we renegotiate based on actual performance. You have operational input, but I have final decision authority on anything related to land management. You have final decision authority on anything related to the financial structure and the buyer relationships in St. Louis and further east. We put everything in writing with an attorney in Caldwell." Augusta was quiet for a moment. Seth watched her think, which was a visible process with her. Something moved behind her eyes. "The 60-40 is fair given that the land is yours," she said. The Decision Authority Division is acceptable. I want a clause that allows either party to propose a renegotiation at any time if circumstances substantially change." "Agreed," Seth said. "Then we have a deal, Mr. Barker." She held out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and her hand was warm, and he released it quickly. "We should ride out to look at the eastern section," she said. "If we are going to build a separate breeding operation there, I need to see the terrain." "After breakfast," he said. They rode out after breakfast on a morning that was clean and windy and smelled of grass and rain coming from the west. Seth rode his own horse, a solid blue roan named Walker, and Augusta rode the bay mare she had brought from Caldwell without complaint. She rode beside him rather than behind him, which he had expected of her by now. He showed her the eastern section of Barker's Ridge, the land that sloped down toward a creek that ran reliably through most of the year, the section with the better grass and the hidden springs and the natural shelter of the limestone ridgeline along the north edge. He explained the water management and the grazing rotation he used. She listened and asked questions that revealed she had in fact spent 3 months seriously studying cattle ranching, not just the financial aspects but the operational ones. "You mentioned cooperative drives with other ranchers," she said at one point, looking out at the creek from the top of the eastern ridge. "Who specifically?" "Jim Reardon has 800 acres to the north of us," Seth said. "He's been here longer than I have. We've driven together twice. Good man. Then there's the Alvarez family, about 6 miles east, 3 generations on that land. They run a smaller operation, but their cattle are some of the best bred in the Flint Hills. And there is Thomas Garrett to the south." He paused slightly. Augusta caught the pause. "You do not like Thomas Garrett." "I do not dislike him," Seth said carefully. "I am cautious about him. He expanded his operation 3 years ago in ways that I found difficult to fully account for by ordinary means." Augusta looked at him. "You think he defrauded someone?" Seth was quiet for a moment. "I think it is possible that some of the homesteaders who sold to him were working with incomplete information." "That is a very measured way of saying yes," Augusta said. "Something passed between them then, a brief current of recognition." Seth watched her face and saw something flash behind her eyes, something she controlled quickly, and he filed it away. "If we build the breeding operation here," Augusta said, redirecting with the efficiency of a woman who knows when she has revealed more than she intended, "we should use the Alvarez family's bull line, if their cattle are as well bred as you say. That would mean building a relationship with them before we can formalize any arrangement," Seth said. "I know them, but you would be a new element." "Then introduce me," Augusta said simply. He looked at her. "You are not concerned about how it will be received, a widow from St. Louis, a new business partner, a woman operating independently in this territory." Augusta Wainwright turned to face him fully on the ridge with the wind moving through her dark hair and the enormous Flint Hills sky behind her and said, "I have spent 8 years being concerned about how things would be received, Mr. Barker. I find I have very little patience left for that particular concern." Seth Barker looked at her for a moment, and then he did something he had not done in a long time. He smiled, a real one. "All right," he said, "we will ride to the Alvarez place on Thursday." The Alvarez family received them in a manner that was warm but measured, which was how Seth had told Augusta they would receive strangers. The family patriarch, Miguel Alvarez, was a man of perhaps 60 with deep brown skin, weathered by decades of Kansas sun, and a quiet authority that Augusta recognized as the particular dignity of a person who has built something real from very little and knows exactly what it is worth. He greeted Seth in a combination of English and Spanish that Seth answered in kind, and when Seth introduced Augusta as his new business partner, Miguel studied her with direct and assessing eyes. His wife, Consuelo, who was a small, fierce woman with sharp intelligence and exceptional coffee, brought Augusta into the kitchen almost immediately and proceeded to ask her questions that were polite on the surface and deeply probing underneath. Augusta answered them honestly, including the fact that she was a widow. including the fact that the proposal to partner with Seth had been her idea, including the fact that she intended to be present and operational rather than a distant financial interest. Consuelo looked at her for a long moment and then said in accented but precise English, "My husband's family has been on this land for 2 generations. Before the land was Kansas. We have had many neighbors who were honest and many who were not. Seth Barker is an honest man. If you are partnering with him, we will give you the same good faith we give him, but we do not extend that twice." "That is entirely reasonable," Augusta said, "and accurate. I would not trust someone who extended it twice either." Consuelo smiled then quickly and poured more coffee. Miguel and Seth were in the yard discussing the bull bloodlines, and when Augusta came back out, Miguel looked at her and said, "Consuelo likes her. That is uncommon." "I gathered," Seth said. "You are bringing something new to the Flint Hills, Seth," Miguel said. He was looking at Augusta, who had gone to the fence to look at the cattle in the near pasture with focused attention. "I do not only mean the cattle operation." Seth did not answer that. The ride back to Barker's Ridge was long and golden in the afternoon light, and they talked about what the Alvarez partnership could look like, and what timeline made sense for introducing the new breeding herd, and Augusta had a notepad and was writing as she rode, which Seth found simultaneously impractical and admirable. "You cannot actually read that later," he said, looking at the notepad. "The handwriting must be extraordinary." "My handwriting is always extraordinary," Augusta said, without looking up. "Even on horseback at a trot. Especially on horseback at a trot. It is a point of personal pride." He laughed. It was unexpected, the laugh, and Augusta looked up from the notepad quickly as if she had caused something surprising and was not sure what to do about it. They arrived back at the ranch house in the early evening. Caleb had been working fence on the north section, and came in dusty and tired and greeted Augusta with the tentative politeness of a young man trying to calibrate how he was supposed to behave in this unprecedented situation. Domingo was already at the bunkhouse and did not appear for supper, which Seth said was his normal behavior and not a commentary on anything in particular. Augusta had planned to ride back to Caldwell the following morning to meet with the attorney there and begin the paperwork. But when morning came, there was weather moving in from the northwest, a serious spring storm that Domingo came to the yard to report on with the authority of a man who had been reading Kansas weather for 40 years. The clouds building on the horizon were the wrong color and moving at the wrong speed. Seth looked at them for 30 seconds and turned to Augusta. "You are not riding in that," he said. "I have ridden in weather before." "Not Kansas weather," Domingo said, which was possibly the longest sentence Augusta had heard him produce. Augusta looked at the clouds. She had in fact not ridden in Kansas weather, and she was honest enough to acknowledge that there was a significant difference between whether she knew and whether she did not know. "One more day," she said. "I will write to the attorney to reschedule." The storm came in by midday. It was a serious piece of work, the kind of spring storm that the Flint Hills produced with periodic intensity to remind everyone who was in charge of the territory. Lightning over the eastern ridge. Rain that came horizontally and found every gap in the ranch house. Thunder that rolled so deep and sustained it felt like the earth itself was objecting to something. The cattle were settled in the lower pasture with natural shelter, and Seth had checked them twice before the worst of it hit. They sat inside the ranch house, and the storm pressed against the windows and the stove threw good heat into the room. They played cards. It was Augusta's suggestion. She produced a deck from her travel bag, which Seth found entirely characteristic of her, and they played several hands of poker at the scarred table while the storm raged outside. She was a better player than he was, which she did not mention because she did not need to. The cards made it plain enough. "Where did a congressman's wife learn to play poker?" Seth asked after she won the 4th consecutive hand. "From my father," Augusta said, dealing with practiced efficiency. "He said it was the most honest game in existence because it did not pretend to be fair." You work with what you have, and you read the other person, and you decide whether what you have is worth committing to or whether you cut your losses. That is a philosophy that extends beyond cards, Seth said. Everything that is worth understanding extends beyond the thing it looks like on the surface, Augusta said. She looked up from the cards. He was watching her with that look again, the one she could not categorize. She made herself hold his gaze. There is something you are not telling me, he said, not accusing, observing. There are a great many things I am not telling you, Augusta said. We have been acquainted for 3 days. True, he said. But some of the things you are not telling me are relevant to the partnership. She set the cards down. The storm was loud against the windows. She looked at the stove for a moment, at the red light showing through the grate. She thought about what she had decided and what she had not decided and what the cost of each would be. Theodore's money, she said. Part of it. Not the portion in my own trust, which is entirely clean and is what I used to fund the investment amount in our agreement, but the portion that came from Theodore's estate directly. She stopped. I cannot tell you the full origin of it. I can tell you that I believe it was acquired through means that harmed people who deserved better. And I can tell you that I intend to use it to build something that does the opposite of harm. Seth was very still. And the land proposal, he said slowly, coming to the Flint Hills specifically. I cannot explain all of it, Augusta said. Not yet, perhaps not ever in complete detail. What I can tell you is that nothing about our agreement puts you in any legal or moral jeopardy. The money in your account will be the money from my trust. The rest of it I am using to settle what can be quietly settled. She held his gaze. She would not look away from this. Seth was quiet for a long time. The storm pressed at the windows. The homesteaders who sold to Garrett, he said finally. Augusta did not answer. You are here in the Flint Hills partly because of them, he said. Not a question. A careful assembly of pieces. I cannot confirm or deny the specifics, Augusta said. I am asking you to trust that I am not using our partnership for anything dishonest. I believe you, Seth said. She blinked. You believe me. Yes, he picked up the cards and shuffled them. You could have told me nothing. You told me something. That is the direction of honesty. He looked at her. And I have eyes. You are not a woman who arrived here for comfortable reasons. Something that had been held very tightly in Augusta's chest since she had found Theodore's letter in November loosened slightly, just fractionally, but she felt it. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Seth said. I may have more uncomfortable questions later. I expect you will, she said. Deal the cards, Mr. Barker. Seth, he said, dealing. She looked at him. Seth, she said. The storm broke in the night. By morning the world outside was washed clean and brilliant, the grass electric green and the sky so purely blue it looked painted, and every limestone outcropping was water-dark and gleaming. Augusta stood on the porch with her coffee and thought that she understood now why a person would build a life in this specific place. There was something about the Flint Hills after a storm that felt like a beginning. Seth came and stood beside her. They had an agreement to formalize, and she needed to ride to Caldwell, and he needed to get back to the north fence that the storm had probably damaged, and there were practical things pressing at the morning from every direction. But they stood for a few minutes and looked at the land. Will you come back, Seth said, after the attorney? I will need to spend considerable time here to make the operation work, Augusta said. I will need to be present, not managing from a distance. I had thought I would look for suitable lodgings in Caldwell. The boarding house there is not good, Seth said. Mrs. Halloran runs it, and she is not a bad woman, but the building is drafty and the food is inconsistent, and it is 10 miles from the eastern section where the breeding operation will be. Augusta waited. She was fairly certain she knew where this was going, and she was not sure how she felt about it. The room that was my sister's, Seth said. He was looking at the eastern ridge, not at her. It is unused. It is practical. The arrangement would be a business one and would be conducted as such. There is nothing improper about a business partner residing on the working property. He paused. But I understand if you prefer the boarding house. Augusta considered it for one full, honest minute. The arrangement would need to be transparent, she said. I will not have rumors that interfere with either of our reputations or the business. Agreed. And I retain the right to dissolve the living arrangement independently of the business arrangement if either of us finds it untenable. Also agreed. Then I accept, Augusta said, on a trial basis. She was back from Caldwell within the week. The attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Carruthers who had been skeptical of the arrangement, until Augusta produced her documents and made her financial position clear, had drafted an agreement that protected both parties and was entirely legal and appropriate. Seth had signed it without significant amendment. She had returned to Barker's Ridge with her luggage and her books and the particular focused energy of a woman who has made a decision and intends to execute it thoroughly. The weeks that followed were the most productively extraordinary of Augusta's adult life. She worked. She worked the way she had always wanted to work, with her whole capacity rather than the ornamental portion of it that Theodore's world had required. She rode the sections of the ranch every morning with Seth, learning the land the way he knew it, from the ground up. She met with buyers in Wichita twice in the first month, leveraging the St. Louis contacts she had built through Theodore's political social network and redirecting them toward legitimate cattle commerce. She negotiated the terms of the Alvarez breeding arrangement, which Miguel ultimately agreed to on terms that were favorable to both families and that Consuelo said were the fairest arrangement they had made in 15 years. She also began quietly doing what she had come to the Flint Hills to do. Through Carruthers, the attorney, she made 3 anonymous payments to former homesteading families in southern Kansas. The amounts were not large enough to restore everything they had lost, but they were enough to matter. They were described as settlement payments from an unnamed estate, which was legally defensible and morally accurate. Carruthers asked no questions beyond what was necessary, and Augusta gave him credit for professional discretion. She had identified 2 additional families through land office records, but had not yet found a way to make contact that would not raise questions. She was working on it. Through all of this, the daily texture of life at Barker's Ridge was doing something to her that she had not accounted for. She had not accounted for the way the mornings felt, the coffee on the porch, the meadowlarks, the quality of light in the Flint Hills that was different from anywhere else she had been, something to do with the latitude and the openness of the sky. She had not accounted for the particular comfort of being in a house where someone else was present and competent, and not requiring anything of her except honesty. She had not accounted for Seth. He was not a man who declared things. He did not make speeches or grand gestures. He communicated through action, and through the specific kind of attention that meant he noticed what mattered. He noticed when she was tired and made coffee without being asked. He noticed when she was stuck on a problem and left her alone with it rather than offering solutions she had not requested. He noticed when she had ridden hard all morning and came home sun-dark and hungry, and he had supper already on the stove. She noticed things about him too. The way he talked to his cattle, quietly and without embarrassment, because he said they were sensitive to tone and responded to it. The way he treated Caleb, who was 20 and somewhat reckless, with a patient authority that corrected without diminishing. The way he and Domingo communicated through a shorthand built from years of shared work, a small nod, a lifted chin, a particular silence that meant the same thing as several sentences. The way he read in the evenings, sitting near the stove with a book held at a slight angle to catch the lamplight, and sometimes looked up and found her looking at him, and neither of them looked away immediately. She was in trouble. She had known she was in trouble since the first morning on the porch when he had said yes. She was now in considerably more trouble, and she was approaching it the way she approached everything, by acknowledging the fact clearly and deciding what to do about it. What she decided to do about it was nothing. Not yet. The business was new and fragile and important, and she would not compromise it with something personal. She would not put Seth in the position of feeling obligated by proximity. She was his business partner and his tenant in a practical sense, and she would remain exactly that until she had reason to believe otherwise. The reason arrived in early summer in a manner that was not subtle. Thomas Garrett rode onto Barker's Ridge in the third week of June. Augusta was in the yard working through a ledger at the outside table she had set up for fine weather work when she heard the horse and looked up and saw a man who was broad and red-faced and expensively dressed by Flint Hills standards, riding with the confidence of someone who expected to be accommodated. Seth came out of the barn. "Garrett," he said. His voice was level. His body was not. "Barker." Garrett swung down from his horse without being invited and looked at Augusta with an assessment that was overtly commercial and that she found immediately offensive. "This the widow from St. Louis I have been hearing about. Mrs. Augusta Wainwright," Seth said. "My business partner." "Business partner," Garrett repeated with a smile that implied inverted commas around the phrase. "Well, the Flint Hills are full of surprises." He looked at Augusta. "Voss sends his regards, Mrs. Wainwright." The name hit her like cold water. Gerald Voss, the name from Theodore's letter, the man who had organized the fraud. She kept her face completely still. She had 8 years of practice keeping her face completely still. "I am not acquainted with a Mr. Voss," she said. "No," Garrett's smile did not change. "That is interesting, given that your late husband was." Augusta stood from the table slowly, unhurried, and closed the ledger. "Mr. Garrett, what is the purpose of this visit?" "I came to talk business with Barker here," Garrett said, though his eyes stayed on Augusta. "But I find I'm more interested in talking to you. See, Gerald Voss has some concerns about certain financial movements being made by the Wainwright estate. Anonymous payments to people who perhaps had dealings with Theodore. Voss thinks those payments look like preparation for a conversation he does not want to have." Seth was watching Augusta. Augusta looked at Garrett with complete steadiness. "My late husband's estate is my private concern. If a Mr. Voss has legal questions about it, he is welcome to direct them through an attorney. This is not an appropriate venue for this conversation." "No," Garrett said. He was not smiling now. "I suppose it is not, but Voss wanted you to know that he is watching, and that certain partnerships might prove unwise." His eyes moved to Seth, "for both parties." The silence after he rode away was significant. Seth came and stood by the table. He looked at the ledger she had closed and then at her face. She met his eyes. "Voss," he said. "I cannot explain everything," she said. "You don't have to explain everything," Seth said. "I need to know if you are in danger." Augusta looked at him. The question had been direct and unadorned, and the expression with which he asked it was not the expression of a man inquiring about a business risk. It was something different and more fundamental. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "Gerald Voss is a man who protects himself through intimidation primarily. He sent Garrett here because he wanted to see how I would react. Now he knows I did not react, and he has to decide what to do with that information. And if he decides to do more than send messengers," Seth said, "then we address it when it happens." Seth was quiet for a moment. "Augusta," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and they both noticed it. "I would like to know the full story, when you are ready to tell it." She looked at him for a long time. The summer air was warm and smelled of grass and cattle and the particular dry sweetness of the Flint Hills in June. "Tonight," she said, "after supper." She told him all of it that night. The letter in Theodore's desk, the scheme, the 40 families, the decision to burn the letter rather than go to newspapers or courts that would deliver nothing, the anonymous payments. The reason she had come to the Flint Hills specifically, which was that 2 of the families she most needed to reach were in this part of Kansas, and she had needed a legitimate reason to be here that would not draw Voss's attention before she had finished what she came to do. Seth listened to every word. He did not interrupt, and he did not look away from her. When she finished, there was a silence. "You came here to make it right," he said. "I came here to make what I could right," Augusta said. "Not all of it can be made right, but some of it. Using your own money and your own presence and at personal risk," Seth said. "Yes. And you built a genuine business proposal," he said. "That was not a cover story." "That was never a cover story," Augusta said. "Both things are true simultaneously." I needed to be in the Flint Hills and I wanted to build something real. The two requirements aligned and I pursued them both. Seth looked at her for a long time. "What do you need from me to finish what you came to do?" he said. She blinked. She had expected skepticism, possibly anger at the complication, certainly a reasonable concern about his own position. She had not expected this. "I need introductions," she said, "to the two families. Through you they will receive me with appropriate caution rather than with the kind of refusal that a stranger alone would get. I am trying to make anonymous payments, but I also need to ensure the families understand that there is recourse if Voss attempts further action against them." "Jim Reardon knows the families you are likely talking about," Seth said. "He's been watching Garrett and Voss's operations for 2 years. He's collected information. He might have enough to take to a federal land officer rather than a local one. Federal jurisdiction removes the local political protection." Augusta stared at him. "You have been watching this situation." "I told you I was cautious about Garrett," Seth said. "I have been cautious with documentation." "You have documentation about Voss's fraud." "I have documentation about what I have personally observed and what Jim Reardon has personally observed," Seth said. "Not everything, but enough to establish a pattern with a federal official who is motivated to act." They looked at each other across the table. "Why did you not go to a federal official before?" Augusta said. "Because before, I had no way to connect the local pattern to someone in Voss's position who had the financial standing to have been his partner," Seth said. "Without that connection, the complaint looks like a property dispute between local interests. With Theodore Wainwright's silent partnership documented, the scale changes. The federal case becomes viable." Augusta sat very still. "You need Theodore's letter." "I need evidence of Voss's connection to someone with political standing," Seth said. "I need confirmation that this was not an isolated local scheme but something with reach. That changes the category of complaint." "I burned the letter," Augusta said. Seth's face stayed even. "But I have something else," Augusta said slowly. "I have Theodore's account records, the quarterly payments. I preserved those. I told myself I preserved them only to document the scope of the restoration I needed to make. But I also knew, on some level, that they might be needed for something else." "Where are they?" "In St. Louis," Augusta said, "with my attorney there, in a sealed envelope that I was told to open only in specific circumstances." "What specific circumstances did you define?" "Federal involvement or imminent personal danger," Augusta said. Seth looked at her. "One of those conditions now exists," he said. "Voss sent a message today." She knew he was right. She had known it since Garrett rode away. She had been hoping she would have more time to quietly complete the restoration without triggering a larger confrontation. Voss watching her meant the quiet phase was over. "I will write to St. Louis tonight," she said. "It will take 2 weeks for the envelope to arrive." "Then we have 2 weeks," Seth said, "to make sure Garrett and Voss do not know what is coming." They worked together with a precision and a trust that Augusta found breathtaking in its completeness. She had never in her adult life had a partner of any kind who simply took her assessment of a situation and matched it with his own without requiring her to justify her competence first. Seth Barker moved through the planning the way he moved through everything, efficiently and with complete commitment to what had been decided, and he brought her information and contacts that doubled her capacity. Jim Reardon turned out to be exactly what Seth had described, a weathered and decent man who had been quietly furious about the homesteader situation for 2 years and who, upon understanding what Augusta was attempting and what documentation she was sending for, shook her hand with an expression of genuine and slightly surprised respect, and said he would contribute everything he had. The envelope from St. Louis arrived in 13 days. Carruthers the attorney received it on Augusta's behalf and brought it to Barker's Ridge in person, which told her that her St. Louis attorney had included a covering note that communicated something of the urgency. She opened it at the table with Seth, and Carruthers present and spread Theodore's account ledgers across the scarred wood. The quarterly payments were there in Theodore's own hand, dated, sourced, and corresponding with precision to the land transactions she and Seth had already documented. Carruthers looked at the ledgers for a long time. "With Reardon's documentation and this," he said carefully, "I believe a federal land commissioner would have sufficient grounds to open an investigation. That investigation, if properly handled, would disable Voss's ability to continue operations and likely result in prosecution." "How long?" Augusta said. "I can have the filing prepared in a week," Carruthers said. "The federal commissioner's office in Topeka would receive it by the following week. After that, it is out of our hands, but the documentation is strong." Augusta nodded. Seth looked at Garrett's property on the survey map spread at the edge of the table and said, "When Voss understands a federal complaint has been filed, he may move before the investigation is complete." "Yes," Carruthers said. "That is a real possibility. What does moving mean?" Augusta said she wanted it named clearly. "It means he either runs or he removes the threat," Carruthers said, with the dry precision of a man who had been a frontier attorney long enough to understand what that phrase covered. "Augusta is a threat," Seth said. His voice had gone very flat. "She is the primary originating witness with direct family connection to the evidence." "Yes," Carruthers said. "Then she cannot be here alone," Seth said. "I am not a person who requires a guardian," Augusta said, with the particular crispness of a woman who has heard that implication too many times. "I know you are not," Seth said, looking at her directly. "And that is not what I am offering to be. I am saying that you should not be alone on this property without someone who is aware of the specific danger, because Voss is capable of hiring people and Caleb is 20 years old and Domingo is excellent, but he is one man." He paused. "I am also saying that I do not want you to be alone in this. I should have said that first." Augusta looked at him. "I do not want you to be alone in this," he repeated quietly, and the plainness of it was so complete that she felt it land somewhere below the level of language. They filed the federal complaint. Carruthers rode to Topeka himself because the situation warranted the speed. Reardon contributed his documentation. Augusta contributed Theodore's account records and a signed statement that Carruthers drafted with legal precision and that she reviewed 3 times and found accurate and acceptable. Then they waited. Garrett rode past Barker's Ridge twice during the waiting period without stopping, which Seth noted and said was reconnaissance. They were careful about patterns. Augusta did not ride alone, not because Seth required it, but because she had evaluated the risk and agreed it was not sensible, and her pride had never been invested in doing foolish things as a demonstration of her independence. She rode with Seth. They covered the ranch and the eastern section and the progress of the breeding operation together, and the work continued because it always continued, and the days were long and warm and close. On the 11th day after the filing, Voss made his move. But it was not the move any of them had anticipated. A man arrived at Barker's Ridge, not Garrett, a stranger, and delivered a letter addressed to Augusta. The letter was from Gerald Voss directly. It did not threaten. It offered money. It offered a substantial sum, more than the total amount Augusta had distributed to the affected families, in exchange for the withdrawal of her testimony and the original account ledgers. The letter was written in the language of a business negotiation, and it was one of the more nauseating documents Augusta had read in a life that included Theodore's private correspondence. She read it twice. She handed it to Seth. He read it and set it down. "He is frightened," Seth said. "Yes," Augusta said. "A man who offers money instead of continuing to threaten has assessed the situation and decided he cannot win the direct confrontation." "Which means the federal filing is having effect," Seth said. "Which means I should not withdraw anything," Augusta said, "because at this point I am not the only witness. Reardon's documentation exists independently. Carruthers has filed on behalf of multiple parties. Even if I withdrew, the investigation would continue." "Write back and tell him so," Seth said. "Clearly, remove the offer as leverage." She wrote the response at the outside table in the summer air, and it was the clearest and most satisfying letter she had written since the reply to Seth's first inquiry from the land office. She explained that the federal investigation now existed independently of her testimony, and that no financial offer would alter either the documentation or the testimony of multiple parties, and that she considered the matter of contact between them closed. The federal investigation proceeded. Voss, it emerged within weeks, had already retained attorneys and begun negotiating terms rather than risk a full public trial. Gerald Voss was a man who had built his operation on coercion and secrecy, and he understood that daylight was fatal to it. He agreed to a settlement that included full financial restitution to the 43 affected families and the permanent revocation of his land dealings license in Kansas. Garrett cooperated with the investigation in exchange for reduced penalties. The local land office officials who had facilitated the fraud were removed from their positions. It was not everything. It was never going to be everything. But it was considerably more than Augusta had allowed herself to hope for when she sat in her St. Louis parlor with Theodore's ashes and tried to understand what justice could actually look like. She told Seth the outcome the evening the final confirmation letter arrived from Caruthers. They were sitting on the porch in the long summer evening, and the sky was doing what it did out here, spreading color across the western horizon in shades that had no names in any vocabulary she had been taught, and she read the letter and then she sat quietly for a moment. "It is done," she said. Seth looked at her. He had been watching the sky and he turned to look at her, and his expression was something she had been trying not to name for 2 months, and she was tired of not naming it. "Augusta," he said. "Seth," she said. "I have something to say to you," he said. "That has nothing to do with the business or with Voss or with any of the practical things we have been attending to." Her heart was doing something inconvenient. "Say it then," she said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was assembling something that mattered into words, which was not his natural medium. He was a man of action and economy, and he felt things deeply and expressed them with the same deliberate care he applied to everything else. "I did not agree to your proposal because I needed a business partner," he said. "I mean that the business argument was sound, and I would have agreed to a sound business proposal from many people, but I agreed to it because of you specifically. Because of the way you sat down at this table with your documents and your research and said what you actually wanted without apology. I had not seen that in a person in a long time." He paused. "I have thought about you every morning since the first morning you stood on this porch. I have tried to be appropriate about it because you came here for reasons that were serious and important, and I was not going to complicate them. But you are done now. The thing you came to do is done." He looked at her steadily. "And I would like to know if you intend to stay." Augusta set the letter from Caruthers down on the porch railing. "I have a cattle breeding operation to run," she said. "That is not what I asked," Seth said. She looked at him. The evening light was on his face, and his expression was entirely open in a way she had not seen on him before. He had unguarded himself completely for her, and it was the most vulnerable thing she had ever witnessed a person do, this self-contained private man, and it made something in her chest come all the way undone. "I have been in trouble since the first morning on this porch," she said. "When you said yes and smiled, something broke open in his face. I am not the same as Theodore," he said. It was important to him that she understand this. "I know you know that, but I am saying it. Whatever you have here will be yours. The business, the land decisions, your money and your thinking and your capacity. I have no interest in being the kind of man who manages a woman down to an ornament." "I know," Augusta said. "Seth, I know." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. The same hand she had shaken the morning he agreed to the proposal. He held it differently now. She felt the warmth of his fingers over hers and the faint roughness from years of working this land, and she turned her hand to hold his back. They sat like that in the Flint Hills evening and did not speak for a while because neither of them needed to. "I intend to stay," she said eventually. "Not just for the operation." "Good," he said. She looked at him. That is your entire response. Good. Good, he said again, and there was so much warmth in it that she laughed, genuinely and completely, and he smiled the real smile she had first seen on the eastern ridge in the spring, and the evening settled around them like something that had been waiting for exactly this. The autumn that followed was the best of Augusta's life, a statement she examined with some care and found to be entirely accurate. The breeding operation had established itself. The first calf crop from the Alvarez bull line was 14 animals, 12 of them sound and healthy, and exactly what the genetic combination had been designed to produce. And Miguel Alvarez rode over to see them and stood at the fence with his arms resting on the rails and said, in a mixture of languages, that they were very fine animals and that the partnership was a good one. The cooperative drive to Wichita that October, with Reardon and the Alvarez family both joining, was the largest Seth had ever organized and was also the best priced he had ever sold. Augusta had negotiated directly with two buyers from Kansas City, who had connections she had cultivated through the summer, and the final prices reflected that effort in a way that made Seth look at her across the stockyard in Wichita with an expression that made the stockyard somehow irrelevant. They were in Wichita for 3 days and stayed at a hotel that was better than anything Caldwell offered, and Augusta bought herself a new dress because she had been practical about clothing for 9 months, and she felt entitled to something that was not designed primarily for horseback. It was blue, the particular blue-green of a sage in early morning, and Seth saw her in it at dinner on the second evening, and was quiet for a moment in a way that communicated more than any amount of words would have. "You are looking at me as if I have surprised you," she said. "You always surprise me," he said. "I have made my peace with that." She laughed, and they had a very good dinner, and talked about the cattle market and Reardon's plan to expand his herd in the spring, and the Alvarez family's youngest son, who was demonstrating the kind of instinct for cattle that suggested he was going to be the best rancher in his generation, and also about other things that had nothing to do with cattle or land at all. And it was the most comfortable Augusta had felt in a shared conversation since she could remember. On the last evening in Wichita, Seth took her to see a theatrical performance at a hall that was more ambitious than its surroundings warranted but entirely earnest in its effort. A traveling company doing Shakespeare with considerable energy and uneven results. They sat in the middle of a diverse and enthusiastic audience, and Augusta watched the performance and felt Seth's arm against hers, and thought that this particular combination of things, the ridiculous Shakespeare and the warm arm and the good man beside her, and the knowledge that she had built something real and was going home to it, was happiness of the uncomplicated variety. She had not known she was missing uncomplicated happiness. She was glad to have found it. He proposed in November on the eastern ridge at sunset, which was where their partnership had first taken on its real shape in her understanding. He was not elaborate about it. He was Seth, so he was direct and honest and said exactly what he meant without theatrical decoration. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build this life with you for as long as we have. I want your name on this land beside mine, and I want to sit with you on the porch and watch every winter come and every spring come and argue about ledger figures and ride out in the morning and come home in the evening to you." He looked at her in the fading light. "I do not want to do any of this without you anymore." Augusta looked at the valley below and the fading gold of the sky and the green-brown curve of the land she had come to know as well as she had ever known anything. "I did not come here to propose marriage," she said. "No," Seth agreed. "I came here with a business proposal." "You did?" She turned and looked at him with everything she was. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it." He kissed her on the eastern ridge in the November dusk, and it was warm and certain and complete, and the meadowlarks had gone south for the season, but there was a hawk turning slow circles above them in the deepening sky, and the Flint Hills held still around them as they sometimes did, on very particular evenings, as if the land itself was attending to something important. They were married in December by the circuit preacher who came through Caldwell. The ceremony was at Barker's Ridge, inside the ranch house, with Reardon and his wife in attendance and the Alvarez family in full and substantial presence, and Consuelo, who wept with what she described as complete satisfaction. Caleb was there and grinning in the way of a young man who understood he had just witnessed something significant. Domingo stood near the door in his best shirt and did not cry, but was seen to wipe his eyes once quickly, and with minimal acknowledgement. Augusta wore the blue-green dress from Wichita and carried a small arrangement of dried Flint Hills grasses because it was December, and she was not a woman who required impractical flowers when there was beautiful practical material available. Seth wore his best jacket and had done something with his hair that suggested a sincere, if imperfectly executed, effort. And he looked at her when she came to stand beside him with an expression that settled every remaining uncertainty about whether she had made the right decision in riding 2 days on horseback to this particular man with her particular proposal. The preacher spoke the words and they spoke their own back, and Seth put a ring on her hand, a simple gold band that had been his mother's and that he had kept in the box in his room for 10 years without knowing exactly what he was keeping it for. She looked at it on her finger for a moment and then looked at him. "Augusta Barker," she said, testing it. "Augusta Wainwright Barker," he said. "Both names. You built things under both." She loved him very much in that moment, which was saying something given the quantity in which she already loved him. The winter settled in and they were home together, and it was the first winter in 10 years that the ranch house was not silent in the evenings. They read by the stove and argued about ledger figures and played cards, and talked about the spring plan for the eastern section, and talked about other things that had nothing to do with the operation at all. And the days had a texture of fullness that Augusta recognized as the thing she had not known she was building toward when she boarded the train from St. Louis with her $12,000 and her carefully researched land proposal. The following spring, when the grass was coming electric green again and the meadowlarks were back on the fence posts, and the calf crop from the breeding operation was even better than the first one, Augusta told Seth that she was expecting. He was in the barn when she told him. He turned from what he was doing and looked at her and then sat down on the nearest available surface, which was a hay bale, which was not what a man in the grip of such news intended to do but was what he did. "A baby," he said. "That is typically what expecting means," Augusta said, but gently. He stood back up. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something layered and deep and reaching back years, 10 years of alone and building and waiting for something he had not even let himself name. "Augusta," he said. "Seth," she said. He came to her and she went to him, and he held her with the particular careful intensity of a man holding something irreplaceable, and she rested her face against his shoulder and felt his hand in her hair, and the barn smelled of hay and horses, and the spring was coming in through the open door, and she thought that she had arrived at Barker's Ridge with a proposal for a rancher and left, not just left the boarding house in Caldwell, but left the life she had been living before this. With something she had not thought to propose. She had not thought to propose love. She had not thought to propose belonging. She had not thought to propose this, the spring morning and the man who held her and the future growing quietly and secretly inside her body. She had not thought to propose any of it. It had found her anyway. Their son was born in October of 1884 in the ranch house, with Consuelo Alvarez in attendance as she had firmly announced she would be months earlier, and no one had questioned this because Consuelo on a decided point was an immovable feature of the landscape. He was a healthy and loudly opinionated child, and they named him James Thomas Barker, the James for Jim Reardon, who had been more help than could be properly accounted, and the Thomas for Seth's father, who had loved this land and drawn Augusta's portrait above the fireplace in charcoal all those years before. Seth held his son on the evening of his birth and stood by the window and looked out at the Flint Hills going dark under an October sky full of stars, and was a man who had nothing left to wish for, which is a rarer condition than most people understand, and a far more complete one than he had ever expected to reach. Augusta watched him from the bed and thought about the train from St. Louis and the land office inquiry, and the letter from a rancher in the Flint Hills who had written back directly and said, "Come if you are serious." She thought about the morning on the eastern ridge when they had first looked at the land they would build together. She thought about the proposal she had brought, careful and documented and rehearsed for 3 weeks on the train, and the things she had not thought to bring and had found here anyway in this place, with this man, in this life that was entirely and completely hers. The years at Barker's Ridge had their seasons and their weights and their gifts. The breeding operation expanded, and by 1886, the Wainwright-Barker cattle were among the most recognized in the Flint Hills for quality, and the buyers from Kansas City and Chicago knew the name and paid accordingly. Reardon eventually retired, and his land was purchased by a young family from Nebraska with good instincts and a willingness to learn, and Seth spent considerable time in their first 2 years helping them understand the particular demands of the country, because it was what good neighbors did. The Alvarez family's youngest son, whose instincts had been so promising, grew into the most skilled rancher of his generation as Augusta had predicted, and when he married a woman from Emporia who was a schoolteacher and who took one look at the Flint Hills from the Alvarez Ridge and decided she was staying forever, they were all at the wedding. Consuelo taught Augusta to cook several things that were considerably better than anything Augusta had previously been capable of, and Augusta taught Consuelo a method of account-keeping that improved the Alvarez operation's financial planning, and they were friends of the particular kind that requires no maintenance because the foundation is already sound. Caleb stayed at Barker's Ridge for 3 more years and then went north to Wyoming to try his hand at horse breeding, which turned out to be what he was actually suited for, and sent letters back twice a year that always arrived in the spring and the fall and always contained more optimism than specifics. Domingo remained. He was part of the land in the same way the limestone outcroppings were part of the land. He would retire and die, eventually, on Barker's Ridge, which was as it should be. Augusta finished what she had come to do for the families Theodore had wronged. All 43 of them received something. The amounts varied depending on what could be traced and what could be calculated with reasonable accuracy, but the intention was complete, and the doing of it had taken 3 years of patient, careful work. She did not tell anyone outside of Seth and Carruthers the full scope of it. She did not require recognition for it. It was a debt, and she paid it. She also did something she had not planned at the outset, which was to write, in the evenings by the stove in the winters at Barker's Ridge, a careful and anonymous accounting of how the fraud had worked and how it had been dismantled, in enough detail to be useful to anyone who encountered a similar scheme. Carruthers had it published in a legal journal under a pseudonym, and said that it was cited 3 times in subsequent years by attorneys dealing with related cases in Texas and Colorado. Augusta considered that a reasonable outcome for those particular winter evenings. She published other things later. Articles about cattle breeding and range management in agricultural journals, under her own name, which generated some surprise and then some respect, and eventually, as the quality of the Wainwright-Barker operation became undeniable, a correspondence with other ranchers and farmers who wanted to understand what they were doing that worked. Their second child was a daughter, born in the spring of 1887. They named her Clara, for no particular reason except that Seth said it suited her the first time he held her, a small, decisive person who seemed already to have opinions about the world she had arrived in, and the name did suit her. She grew up with her brother's hand-me-down stubbornness and her mother's precision and her father's patience, and the particular confidence of a child who has been raised in a place where she is entirely known and entirely valued. In the summer of 1888, On an evening very much like the one 5 years earlier when Seth had told Augusta he did not want to do any of this without her anymore. They sat on the porch of Barker's Ridge in the warm dusk, and James was in the yard catching fireflies with the focused intensity of a 4-year-old with a serious purpose, and Clara was asleep inside, a short and opinionated nap before demanding supper, and the Flint Hills were doing what they did in high summer, turning gold and amber in the falling light, and the cattle moved in the lower pasture, and the meadowlarks had gone quiet for the evening, but a whippoorwill had started up from somewhere near the creek. "I keep thinking about that first morning," Augusta said. Seth looked at her. "Which morning?" "The first one, when you said yes." She looked out at the ridge. "I had practiced every version of that conversation on the train. I had not practiced for yes." "I noticed," he said. "I was not prepared for you," she said. She said it simply, which was how she said the things that were most true. Seth reached over and took her hand, the same gesture he had made on this porch the evening 5 years ago, the evening it had all shifted into something they stopped being cautious about. He held her hand the same way he always held it, with complete attention and no performance. "I was not prepared for you either," he said. James came running across the yard with both hands cupped around a captured firefly, the light pulsing green-gold between his fingers, his face incandescent with the achievement. "Look," he said, arriving breathless at the porch steps. They looked. "Perfect," Augusta told him. "Perfect," Seth agreed. The boy opened his hands and the firefly rose into the warm summer dark and was gone, and James watched it go with an expression of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. And the Flint Hills settled into their evening, and the whippoorwill called from the creek, and the porch held the two of them and what they had built, and what they would continue to build. And all of it was real, and all of it was theirs, and all of it, every particular and breathing acre of it, was exactly enough. Augusta Wainwright had arrived with a proposal for the rancher. She had left with something she had not thought to propose. She had left with Seth. With James and Clara and the blue-green evenings, and the spring grass, and the hidden springs on the eastern ridge that did not appear on any survey map. She had left with partnership in the truest meaning of the word, the kind where two people bring everything they have and build something that neither could have built alone, and are changed entirely by the building of it, and grateful, on ordinary summer evenings when the fireflies are out and the man beside you is holding your hand and your children are running in the yard, for every difficult and extraordinary step that brought them here. She was grateful. She was home.